Let's talk about a masterpiece within a masterpiece. To borrow a phrase from Sunday in the Park with George, the art of making art is putting it together. So today, I'm going to give you a quick introduction to Stephen Sondheim and James Lapine's Sunday in the Park with George, and we will be focusing on how Seurat made art and comparing that with how Sunday in the Park with George's team, all those folks, made their art. The musical begins with a blank stage and the character of Georges Seurat saying, "White, a blank page or canvas. The challenge, bring order to the whole through design." Composition, balance, light, and harmony. And we just heard the Sunday theme being introduced. Sunday by the blue, purple, yellow, red water. The theme to the song that closes both the first act and the second act. What you just heard was fictional Georges Seurat's principles of art, or how you put the tools of art to work. You can buy a lot of merch with those words on them, saying order, design, tension, composition, balance, because it's a key component to the musical. But also they did root that in the truth of Georges Seurat's writings about his art. So I have chosen to organize today's discussion around these concepts. The first one we are starting with is order. So order, the artistic principle, is about making some sense out of a group of related objects and having each one reinforce the other ones. So it's interesting to compare Georges Seurat's desire for order with the desire Stephen Sondheim has for order. So when I read this quote of Georges Seurat, I think, oh my goodness, he was begging for his painting to be made into a musical. I think he would just be thrilled when you listen to this quote. "I want to make modern people in their essential traits move about as they do on those friezes and place them on canvases organized by harmonies of color." So he's referencing friezes, which of course this is the Parthenon in Greece, what Athens' Parthenon looked like. And so friezes, like sculpted images of people, it has a sense of stillness and also a sense of, as he says, movement simultaneously somehow. So comparing the rule writing, Stephen Sondheim in 2011, when he was 81 years old, he is the composer and lyricist of the musical. He released the first of 2 volumes about his art making. This included all of his lyrics to that point, and he also discusses his music and tells related stories in the book as well. And within the book, he begins it by laying out his rules. He says, "In no particular order and to be inscribed in stone, content dictates form. Less is more, and God is in the details. This is all in the service of clarity, without which nothing else matters." So you can see, Seurat and Sondheim did not take their art lightly. Like, they are playful at times. But for sure, this is a very serious thing for them, and they had rules for themselves, and there was a strictness to the approach of their artistic creation. This would be a good time to introduce Stephen Sondheim. Order in art can also describe the sequence, right? And the sequence is important more in different kinds of art, like in film, for example, or if you're putting pieces of art in an order in a museum for people to look at, order of like musical components. Sondheim, the moment that Sunday in the Park with George holds in his oeuvre in terms of the sequence is really important. He had had many substantial successes, from lyric writing for West Side Story and Gypsy to composing music and lyrics for A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, Company, Follies, Night Music, Sweeney Todd, but he had just had a particularly devastating flop with Merrily We Roll Along. It essentially ended his relationship with Hal Prince for a good time. He seriously considered becoming a mystery novelist, believe it or not. And this reminds me of within the musical when the character who is helping George, second act George, make his art says, "I'm going back to NASA. There's just too much pressure in this line of work." I think that's hilarious. So fortunately, rather than abandoning the theater through a mutual friend's suggestion, Stephen Sondheim met James Lapine on June 12th, 1982. And James had seen Sweeney Todd 3 times, but it was his only exposure to Sondheim's work, thankfully, because he thinks that if he had had more knowledge of Sondheim's work, he probably would have been extremely intimidated and not able to collaborate with him. As many Sondheim fans know, his primary mentor was Oscar Hammerstein II, whose contributions to the American musical theater as the book writer and lyricist to Showboat, Oklahoma, Carousel, South Pacific cannot be overstated. He was an optimist to the core. He famously wrote the lyrics of Edelweiss from his deathbed. "Blossom of snow, may you bloom and grow forever." Meanwhile, Sondheim's ambivalence has previously yielded at this point in his career gems like "You're always sorry, you're always grateful," or "What's hard is simple, what's natural comes hard." So to suggest that Sondheim was not an optimist would be, again, an understatement. He was always looking at both sides of things pretty intensely. But he believes meeting Lapine forever changed his work. The evidence not only is in Sunday in the Park with George, but also in Into the Woods, which is fantastic and probably one of his more well-known musicals, and Passion, which is my personal favorite. In Look, I Made a Hat, Sondheim explains, "When I look back as objectively as I can at the shows I wrote before James and contrast them with Sunday in the Park with George and the others I wrote with him, it seems clear to me that a quality of detachment suffuses the first set, whereas a current of vulnerability, of longing, informs the second. By having to express the straightforward, unembarrassed goodness of James' characters, I discovered the Hammerstein in myself, and I was better for it." On to the next principle, design. So not surprisingly, the scenic design by Tony Strages won the Tony Award in 1984. It might be expected with a show that was based on a painting, but the show was actually nominated that year for 10 Tonys, winning only 2, both of them for design. But it's also not surprising because James Lapine, who was a first-time Broadway director during Sunday in the Park with George, had earned an MFA in design. And he spent many years in the field of graphic design, working in California, on the West Coast, and then he ended up teaching design at Yale School of Drama. His interest was in images, just as Stephen Sondheim had an avant-garde sensibility to the music that he composed. James had a pretty unconventional style of approaching what might inspire a musical. So he asked Stephen Sondheim what he wanted to write, and Sondheim said, "Theme and variations. I would love to write themes and variations." And then he pulled out a magazine that had been a tribute to the Mona Lisa, and like a bunch of different images of the Mona Lisa with the mustache, or the Mona Lisa made out of polka dots or whatever. And then James continued for them to start looking at other images, and he pulled out, famously, the image of Sunday Afternoon on the Island of Le Grand Jatte by Seurat. It was painted in 1884, and they're looking at it, they're going, okay, there's 3 dogs, 8 boats, 48 people, a monkey. Only one character is moving. In fact, the character who's moving doesn't even really seem, it's the little girl in mid-run, doesn't really seem like a focal character. And then none of the characters are looking at each other. Why aren't they looking at each other? Who are they? What is happening in this weird little story? But James Lapine said, "But who's missing from the image?" And Sondheim said, "I don't know." And James says, "The artist." And that was the kickoff. They were like, we definitely have to make a musical out of this. By the time they met the next time, Lapine had like laid out the painting, and he had put a paper over the top of it, a see-through paper, and he had marked, okay, what if this is the mistress, and what if this is a rival artist, and this is like the maid or whatever for a different family. He's a boatman, guessing who he thinks the characters would be. So it's interesting that instead of rooting something in like a narrative, even though he was the book writer for the musical, he didn't sit down and write first. He sat down with an image and kind of practiced seeing instead of writing. In art, tension is a balance that is maintained by between opposing forces. But in the case of the musical, you can see by looking at this group of people, there was a lot of tension when they were making Sunday in the Park with George. While Sondheim and Lapine had very little conflict between them, Lapine was new to directing musicals, and he was super frustrating the cast. He began the rehearsal process requesting that the actors improvise. Like, he would say things like, let's all sit on the floor and pretend we're having a picnic in the park. And they'd be like, let's go home until you write a musical and then we'll come back and act in it. So there was a lot of tension in the process of putting this in front of people as early as they did. Composition in art is the way that different elements of the artwork are combined together. But you also could describe it as putting it together. Ding, on the nose, for one of the central songs of the musical. There was a good deal of tension around the composition specifically because, much like it took 2 years and numerous studies and sketches before George Seurat could complete the painting, the work had an unconventional beginning as a musical. It started as a workshop. So people who were subscribers to Playwrights Horizons were getting to go and see a work that was unfinished. In fact, when it first started, they didn't even have Finishing the Hat in Act 1, and they did not show Act 2 at all. There were 3 weeks of performances, and only the last 3 performances had a very tiny sketch of what would become Act 2. So they had contracted Mandy Patinkin and Bernadette Peters on the basis of Sondheim's reputation, but they had only really heard one song apiece at that time, and a lot of the music came in even after they were previewing on Broadway. The next principle of design is balance. So balance refers to the visual weight of the elements of the composition. The work is stable. It's balanced. And so here I highlight the characters who were the critics to our fictional George Seurat. So these are a rival artist within the musical dubbed Jules and his wife Yvonne. But the criticism of George Seurat's work that they offer is historical, not fictional. In Act 2, it's actually a fact included in the show that when Seurat was exhibiting Sunday for the first time, his fellow impressionists, Monet, Renoir, Sisley, they all refused to have their work hang in the show. They hated it that much. When Jules and Yvonne sing in the musical that Seurat's Bathers is so drab, so cold, and so controlled, no life, it's quite a parallel to the real-life critics of Stephen Sondheim and James Lapine's work, not just in Sunday in the Park with George, but their work together in other areas as well. On to the principle of light. So here are 2 images of Seurat's studies in Conti, which is, unlike charcoal, it has wax binding, but it's a similar thing. And he has an incredible ability, even though he's working in black, to make the absence of black appear as light in his images. So he really explored light with his painting style as well. In fact, the method of painting he created, instead of just being called pointillism, was often referred to as chromoluminarianism or divisionism. And chromoluminarianism is the connection of color and light, which is also one of the songs in the show. And it was a way of trying to get the eye to fuse the 2 colors that are next to each other within the retina. So it was supposed to, he thought, make the canvas shimmer. Even in these black and white Conti drawings, his areas of white suggest expanses of light. They are just stunningly beautiful. And of course, the second Tony Award that this musical won went to lighting designer Richard Nelson. And Richard Nelson also had the privilege of lighting the musical Into the Woods. The last design principle, harmony, is achieved when the elements of an artwork come together in a unified way. Certain elements are repeated, yet they still look and feel similar. Not monotony, not chaos, Harmony is that perfectly honed combination of both of those things. The manner in which Sunday uses theme and variations may have only yielded 2 Tony Awards, but beyond accruing legions of fans, it won the Pulitzer Prize for drama. So this photo was taken the day that it was announced that it won the Pulitzer Prize, and you can see Stephen Sondheim looking on as Bernadette Peters ran down to the theater. She was no longer in the production, but she ran down to the theater to give James Lapine a kiss on the mouth. She was so excited that the musical had ultimately arrived at such a wonderful celebration, a fantastic reception. It just took some time for it to get there. The original producer, Andre Bishop, who was of Playwrights Horizons Theater, he was excited when he went to see the original painting after he'd seen the musical. He'd gone through that whole process and gotten to know Surratt through the process of getting to know James and Sondheim on their work as well. And he described seeing this painting as startling and lovely and upsetting and inspiring. He said, "I stood and stared for hours until I felt I was both outside the painting and inside it, and definitely a part of it." I dare say, as a person who has visited the painting in Chicago on numerous occasions, this musical holds that same power, that magic. I have traveled the country to see this show more than once, and I always feel richly rewarded by getting to see any theater company take a stab at this brilliant musical. I do hope that you will take the opportunity to witness the glory of Sunday in the Park with George on stage. And next week, we are going to be at Happy's. They're going to have a cocktail specifically for this show. It's going to be called the Sunday in the Park with George. So get thee to Happy's next Sunday and have a cocktail and learn about the music. I will give you some info about the music next weekend. And if you can't make it there, just make sure you've got your tickets. Buy your tickets for Sunday in the Park with George. It's being performed by the El Paso Opera, May 17th and 18th.